Hey everyone, we welcome you to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your hosts Bernhard Gunther and Laura Matsu. The topic of this episode is how to heal toxic shame and not feeling good enough. It's definitely a biggie, which many of us can relate to. So based on this topic, we'll be diving into the difference between shame and guilt, because those two get sometimes confused. What is healthy shame versus toxic shame? It's interesting. There's an aspect of healthy shame and toxic shame's two main phases in people, as well as several strategies on how we can begin to heal from shame. But before we dive into it, little announcement. We have another round coming up of our 12-week private online group coaching program, Time of Transition Embodied Soul Awakening. That's an in-depth 3-month program in psychological and spiritual self-work. And the new dates are July 18th until October 8th. And applications and enrollment has started. You can apply at awakenapply.com or also go to my website at veilofreality.com. Look under courses for the Time of Transition Embodied Soul Awakening course to find out more about it and apply there as well. So, how to heal toxic shame and not feeling good enough. The good old I'm not good enough program that comes up for many of us.
Yeah, I think this is really a main kind of core wound of the human condition as well, that we all kind of struggle with this kind of feeling of just not being good enough. And, you know, it's gone on for a really long time. A lot of us our whole lives. And the reason why we've come to realize that it's super important, especially in context with like inner work, psycho-spiritual self-work, is that it can actually get in the way of everything else. So if you don't deal with the toxic shame-based identity, it will be very hard for you to even face yourself clearly, face your situation, face who you are, face whatever's going on with you in your own psyche, you know, because the shame will almost create this protective barrier around certain aspects of your personality, your shadow most likely, that you find to be unacceptable. And it will have all of these kind of defense mechanisms kind of pushing everything away. So I've seen, you know, especially people, by the way, this is a very strong thing in people who have strong Virgo, 6th house placements astrologically, is like this I'm not good enough program has run them kind of to the ground, and they've created all sorts of like false selves basically to protect anyone from ever finding out that that's how they really feel about themselves inside, including themselves.
Yes.
So it can be a really big barrier basically. And the kind of healthy aspect of that Virgo archetype would be humility, would be to recognize that you're not perfect, that you're always improving, that you're going to make mistakes, that you're going to fall down. And it doesn't make you any more unworthy of love because you're that way as well. So that's kind of like, I think is personally also heightened right now, especially because as we've been talking about in several podcasts, we're at this end of this era, this Virgo Pisces axis, basically the end of the Piscean age and then entering the Aquarian age. And all of those themes are exaggerated, you know? So this I'm not good enough program that's very common to this Virgo archetype is you see people, like the majority of humans who walk around in the world literally walk around in a trance of unworthiness. That's what Tara Brach, meditation teacher, calls it, where they don't even see themselves clearly. They don't see reality clearly. And they're literally in this constant trance of I'm not feeling good enough. And then you can see how that's a perfect matrix program as well.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to that as well. The so-called I'm not good enough program. And also, you know, you made a very important point. For a lot of people, the shame is not just conscious, but unconscious. It becomes very buried in the unconscious.
Yes.
And we create the false self, a false personality around it to avoid this deep pain based on this toxic shame, really.
And you know what? The thing is it will become so buried that the only way that they can actually experience the shame is by projecting shame onto other people.
Right.
So people who are very outwardly shaming, that's a projection of actually most likely the toxic shame that they feel about themselves.
We could talk about this in relate to the woke cult.
Exactly.
As well,
That's
right?
what I'm kind of alluding towards, is like the main kind of method of control for the woke and kind of the progressive left these days is to shame people. Like, shame on you, you don't care about grandma, you didn't get the jab, shame on you, you don't put your pronouns in your,
Exactly.
they all control through shame.
Yeah.
This is I've written about this in an article, but it's also an aspect of like the toxic feminine. The toxic feminine controls through guilt and shame. And actually the tyranny that we're seeing on the planet, in my personal view, has way more to do with the toxic feminine than this toxic masculinity that people talk about.
Right.
So that's why it's very relevant, and that's why it affects us. And this is why it's also very important to look at it and to look at the ways that shame operates within yourself, because this is the main method of control of the kind of currently dominating matrix forces, actually.
Exactly. On that note, it reminds me as well, I want to bring this up because it really ties also, before we dive into it deeper, also understanding, there are different levels of consciousness as mapped out by David Hawkins in his book, Power versus Force. We have referenced it quite a few times in our podcast, and also in my articles I've mentioned that. And, on top is enlightenment, peace, joy, love, these higher frequency states of being, going down to reason, acceptance, willingness, courage, then pride. Then it goes lower: anger, desire, fear, grief. And at the bottom of the level of consciousness, at the very bottom, is guilt and shame. Shame at the very bottom, right above death, basically.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who wallow in deep guilt and shame are also prone to be suicidal. I know in my own process, when I was really reveling in deep guilt and shame, that's when the suicide thoughts kicked in.
Mm-hmm. You know what it is, though? So like people may be like harboring toxic shame and have these different faces for it, which we're going to get into in a second. But it's the death of the life of the soul, basically.
Yes.
Like there's a light of your own inner child, actually, which is an essential aspect of healing toxic shame. And toxic shame literally just kind of puts like this stranglehold on the light of your inner child, because you're not allowed to express yourself freely. You're constantly, a lot of people who have this I'm not good enough program run this constant self-critical, either internal or external program. So they either have a strong internal inner critic or a strong external outer critic, depending on how it manifests.
Right.
So, okay. So let's go into the difference between shame and guilt.
Yes, that's a big one.
Okay. So we're going to be referencing two main materials here, mainly actually John Bradshaw. This is a really amazing book called Healing the Shame That Binds You. And also a relationship coach, Jason Gaddis, who also, we watched a recent talk with him about shame. So basically in John Bradshaw's book, he talks about how that shame in itself is not bad because it's this normal human emotion. In fact, it's necessary to feel shame if one is to be truly human. Shame is the emotion that gives us permission to be human. Shame tells us of our limits. Shame keeps us in our human boundaries, letting us know that we can and we will make mistakes and that we all need help. Our shame tells us that we are not God. Healthy shame is a psychological foundation of humility. It is a source of spirituality. It's fascinating because he's speaking exactly to the kind of journey of like kind of like elevating that Virgo archetype as well. And then he talks about toxic shame later. And so it's basically shame is this healthy human emotion that shows us our limitations, that shows us, okay, like I'm not going to be an amazing soccer player the first time I try if I've never played soccer before, for example. We might feel a bit embarrassed. Healthy shame, right? And then he says shame as a healthy human emotion can then be transformed into shame as a state of being. So this is that trance of unworthiness that Tara Brach also talked about. And as a state of being, shame takes over one's whole identity. To have shame as an identity is to believe that one's being is flawed, that one is defective as a human being. Once shame is transformed into an identity, it becomes toxic and dehumanizing. So we'll go into that a little bit more later, but also then I want to differentiate between shame and guilt. So there's healthy shame and toxic shame. Those are two definitions.
Right.
And then there's also guilt. So
and there's also actually healthy guilt.
Yes, exactly. So shame, and this is Jason Gaddis's kind of interpretation, is a perception that you've done something bad or wrong based on your beliefs, values, or integrity. To yourself. Like, oh, like I didn't want to get drunk and, pass out. Like that's when you act out of moral integrity, basically. And then it creates this belief that I'm bad. But then he proposed a really great question. It's like, according to who? According to whose values? According to your parents' values that you've taken in within yourself and says that's yours? According to, the church or your religion or something, So that's this kind of shame piece, right? And then that's a question we want to ask ourselves is, are we shaming or are we being shamed in accordance to something that is our values at all? Because if we're not, like if the church is telling us you can't have sex before marriage, then you do, but your values are not the same as your church that you grew up with, then you need to also look at that, because a lot of people try and shame us according to their values, which is really key.
So we already see right there that our perception or experience of shame directly relates to our internal value system, our upbringing, conditioning, programming, culturally, socially, parental, and all of that. So which we also go deeper shortly.
Exactly. And so that's when you know your values and you act out of integrity, it would be healthy to feel shame and to do things to correct it. Like that's the main point of it. It's a healthy human emotion. We all have it. And then guilt is kind of intertied with shame. And guilt is a perception that you've done something bad or hurt someone else or wrong to someone else, basically. So the impact internally is shame and the impact on the other is guilt,
Exactly.
And then also, again, like, did you really hurt that person, and if you did hurt them, then the healthy thing would be to make amends and, to use the feeling of guilt to be like, hey, I feel really bad about this. I'm so sorry I said that thing. I didn't mean, you know what I mean? Like that's the healthy even aspect of guilt as well. Yeah. They're two functions of conscience. That's why they're so fundamentally important to even the spiritual journey as well.
Yeah, that's very important to understand that there's an aspect of healthy shame and healthy guilt. And even Carl Jung said, and I'm paraphrasing, that, in order to become whole, an integrated whole being, man or human needs to accept and own his own guilt, his healthy guilt, which again, like you said, an aspect of conscience. That's why by the way, another note, which we also be touching upon, psychopaths, sociopaths, they have no shame, no guilt, no moral compass, no conscience whatsoever. They're extremely shameless, right? Hence they act without shame, without guilt, and destroy lives on their path. But yeah, healthy guilt is an aspect of conscience. For example, if you steal something from your friend, you should, quote unquote, feel guilty. Yeah. Right? You're kind of also violating universal law. You're hurting somebody. And that healthy guilt is an aspect to make amends, to stop you from engaging in these harmful activities towards your fellow human beings.
Yeah. And it's really, John Bradshaw also talks about that healthy self-worth is necessary for healthy shame. Mm-hmm. So as long as we have this kind of the thing is a narcissistic personality takes on two faces. I'm not good enough and I'm the best in the world, actually, because they're both distorted views of reality. Like maybe you're not the greatest, but you're also not the worst either, and kind of placing healthy self-worth somewhere in the middle of those two. But, the healthy self-worth is necessary for healthy shame, because if we have a healthy sense of ourself, when we do something and we even feel shame in the moment or we feel guilty, it doesn't touch on that core part of our identity. And that's why I think he named this book Healing the Shame That Binds You, is because there's shame as a state of being Like there's literally people who walk around, whether they're conscious of it or not, in this trance of unworthiness, never feeling worthy, never recognizing their own light, their own power, you know? And it's literally like this, it strangles their personality, you know? And so you need to actually have that healthy self-worth as a foundation to even experience shame in a healthy way. Because if you don't, the moment that someone makes something that you perceive as a criticism, even if it's not, or even if it is, doesn't matter actually, you will spiral into these shame spirals. And that's how you know actually that toxic shame is a part of your identity, when you literally spiral into shame-based narratives whenever this kind of stuff happens.
Yeah, and he also made a good distinction or add on, you know, the whole, this overly narcissistic, inflated ego is also self-importance, right? It's an ego issue. But on the opposite side of the coin, the I'm not good enough program, the self-pity is actually also an aspect of ego. It's very self-centered.
It's narcissistic.
It's very narcissistic, ironically, as well.
Yeah.
But most of us, we identify in this poor me identity, basically.
Yes.
But I want to just add on what you just said. You know, with toxic shame is really you have internalized belief that you are a fundamentally flawed person, right? A person, you can come to believe that your whole self is fundamentally flawed and defective. So healthy guilt would say, for example, I made a mistake or a blunder and I can repair that blunder. When a person's guilt has become neurotic, though, it becomes an immorality shame. A person says, I am a mistake. Everything I do is flawed and defective. So as, what's his name? John Bradshaw says, the demonic potential of shame can lead to the most destructive emotional sickness of a self a person can have.
Yes.
Because you really identify that you are a mistake. Something is fundamentally wrong with you.
Yes, exactly. And remember, this is not necessarily conscious in some people. I think it becomes conscious as you kind of proceed on the path of like inner work, and you start to realize that a lot of your core beliefs kind of come from this I'm not good enough program, you know. But you know, people walk around in a trance, and the whole matrix like feeds off of this I'm not good enough program, the marketing, the like everything,
advertisement,
everything, almost all the matrix programs can tag into this I'm not good enough program. Because as long as you think you're deficient, you will also be externally seeking for things that you think will provide you that feeling of good enoughness, basically.
I mean, a lot of advertising, the consensus, the mainstream marketing and products is showing you like, you know, you are not happy, you're not fulfilled until you have this product. So in a sense, it is shame-inducing, right? Or nowadays, what we see as well with the whole charade on social media, Facebook, Instagram, you know, models and people showing off their lives and all of that, and we compare ourselves to them, right? We feel ashamed because we have a certain perception, positive shadow projection on these people, and we compare ourselves and don't feel good enough. We feel we're missing something in comparison to others.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very self-shame inducing.
Yeah.
But before we go deeper into the toxic shame, I also want to like, again, it's very important to understand healthy shame. And like you said, and like you mentioned before, healthy shame is essentially a foundation of our spirituality, right? It's a part of humility.
Yeah.
And that's where the balance, same with healthy guilt, comes in on a more practical level. What it really means on the basic level, know your strengths on the healthy level, but also know your limitations.
Yeah.
You know, what you're really good at and what you're not good at. You know, healthy shame points you like to really, like he said, not to assume that you're God. You know, that's a whole other topic, even in the self-help world, you know, where people say you can do and be anything you want. You know what I mean? Like almost this trying to attain godlike status, and that's fundamentally a lie. And then we produce this idealized image of ourselves, which we think we need to achieve or become, when we compare ourselves to that, and that just feeds more and more our toxic shame.
Well, we'll never match up to that idealized image as well.
Yeah.
So can we talk about these two faces of shame? Because you kind of touched on it with the Instagram culture as well. This is really important piece. Yeah. The two faces of shame in our culture. And I find this to be very true. So he says, this is John Bradshaw again, shamelessness. So in our he means like acting like you don't feel ashamed of everything. Like you show yourself naked on social media, or like everyone look at me, you know. And he actually says in our shameless culture, sex has become depersonalized. And because, you know, shame is basically healthy. Shame is a guardian of our sexuality, so that we're not running naked in the street whenever, we want, like a child would, basically, so this kind of, and so there's this shamelessness. So like, I can't be shamed. I don't care about anything, kind of whatever attitude, people who also, have trauma and then have a lot of sex partners are also engaging in this aspect of shamelessness, like just being like, I don't care, I'm just casual sex, etc. So that's one face. And then the other face is righteousness, self-righteousness, so acting like you're above shame, basically. Because, and he says, since healthy shame says we can and will make mistakes, then righteousness becomes a kind of shameless behavior. All in all, the religious system has been a major source of toxic shame for many people. So when we act above other people, when we act like we're better than other people, when we act because we subscribe to a certain religion or diet, or even we do shadow work or we meditate and that makes us better than other people, that can potentially be this righteous form of shame. So we want to really look at that, because I have it sometimes in some areas of my life. I think we all do, but that's a really big face of it, because again, we're acting like above human or we're acting below human.
So that's a very important point. And again, that might actually trigger some people, but you mentioned the whole idea about shameless culture. Sex has become depersonalized, and we see nowadays, especially in New Age, Tantra, whatever, Burning Man crowd out there, of just this idea of body positivity and women sexualizing themselves, showing off, not necessarily naked, but very sexual poses. They kind of feed off of all the attention. And there's a shamelessness behind that, even in the polyamory, many lovers, sexual openness and all of that. Sexual shame is a whole topic in itself, but when it becomes shameless and you just like, do whatever you want because you think you're free and so open-minded, but unconsciously this kind of shamelessness is based on internalized, unconscious, toxic shame.
Yes.
So that's
it could be.
So shamelessness is based on very toxic shame.
Because that's what he gets into later, is that essentially shame is the guardian of the sacredness of our sexuality.
Right.
Like it's healthy. Like if my shirt just blew off in the wind in front of a crowd of people, it would be the healthiest thing in the world for me to cover myself up and kind of cower a little bit, which is a somatic gesture for shame. So, and also, I'm sure maybe people disagree, but I don't personally think that like we're married, I'm not going to share my sex life and my body with someone who I'm not in that type of relationship with, I think it's healthy to also, protect your body and your sexuality a little bit, especially around, because it's like, it's the most sacred and vulnerable part of you. It's not, it's healthy to not want to show that to everyone.
Yeah. And in adultery, engaging in all of that, there should be actually healthy shame and healthy guilt coming up as an act of conscience.
Yes.
Right?
And then, so that's one thing. And then there's a self-righteousness. So it's almost like there's one face that's like, that's almost going to one side of the pendulum. It's like, I don't feel shame about anything. Just look at me naked on the internet everywhere. I don't care, And then there's the self-righteousness as well. Be like, I would never do this. I would never do that. And that's when people adopt all these isms to their personality, and they adopt all these, ideologies and adopt them as part of their personality, including, and that's all across the board. Any moment that you start to identify some interest that you have as part of your personality, it could potentially be this kind of self-righteous part of shame, because you're trying to be like, I don't do this, that makes me better than you. I know about this, that makes me better than you. That's a shame game. And
that everybody's affected this to varying degrees, and that ties into the trap of identification, which, by the way, we're going to have an episode on that topic in itself at some point as well. And what that means, like Laura just said, you identify with a certain ideology and belief with an ism. It can be both. You identify as a liberal and you're very self-righteous about that, or also you identify as a conservative, right, whatever, Republican, and you're very self-righteous about that. You identify with the diet, veganism, or anything, you become very self-righteous about that. So there's a shamelessness aspect embedded in that. Obviously, any religion is also based on this identification, can easily turn into self-righteousness. So self-righteousness is an aspect of shamelessness, is an aspect of your unconscious shame you have internalized but covered up with a false persona.
Exactly, yeah. And then the false persona gets to be so hardened, and we get so used to thinking that's who we really are that we don't actually realize that we're cutting ourselves off from the true self, you know?
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing, is like, that's why it's such a barrier to deeper self-work and really looking at that as well. And I mean, I've had to sit with that myself. We're just speaking about this from totally personal experience, just to kind of like normalize it. And I can see, I mean, when I first heard that term from Tara Brach, like healing the trance of unworthiness, I just, like, a light bulb went on my head. I was like, holy crap, my self-image is totally skewed according to actually how my parents didn't mirror me and didn't see me, you know? And so I live in this trance of like not seeing myself clearly that I have to somehow wake myself up from. And I'm still in the process of waking myself up from, actually. And so there's some steps that he goes into, and maybe we can just talk about them one by one. Or yeah. Okay. So this is just from John Bradshaw's, and we'll kind of speak to them. And I agree with him actually on these points, because I've gone through a similar process myself through doing my own inner work and just kind of doing my own soul retrievals actually on my inner child. So
before, I want to just quote him real quick about this toxic shame and the false personality.
Okay,
we just talked about.
Yes.
So John Bradshaw, this is because very well said here, John Bradshaw, again, in his book, which we can highly recommend.
Healing the Shame That Binds You.
Exactly. Toxic shame is unbearable and always necessitates a cover-up, a false self. Since one feels his true self is defective and flawed, mostly unconsciously, one needs a false self that is not detective and flawed, hence the self-righteousness, right? Or shamelessness. Once one becomes a false self, one ceases to exist psychologically. To be a false self is to cease being an authentic human being. The process of false self-formation is what Alice Miller calls soul murder.
Yeah. And that's what we're seeing, you know, the whole Matrix program is just bolster the false self. Oh, you don't feel, and people, you know what, people actually, even myself included, get into self-work because they're trying to just fix this shame-based identity. Right. So it's shame-fueled. It's like they're constantly working on themselves, fueled by shame. And I'm not saying that that's like, you know, you can actually learn some stuff by doing that, but you want to understand like how important it is to address the shame, because the shame is like this cover up to the true light that is actually meant to emerge when you're doing this kind of work, you know. And as long as the shame is covering that up, you're not going to get to the real essence on why you're probably drawn to doing self-work in the first place. Yeah.
And that's why even like it feels like it can be like in never ending digging, you know, trying to, you know, avoid the disillusionment process to really face your shame, because that's necessary in order to heal.
Yeah.
And, you know, as John Bradshaw said as well, hell, in his opinion, is never finding your true self and never living your own life or knowing who you are. This is the fate that lies at the end of the journey of ever deepening toxic shame. So on that note, let's look a bit little bit into the origin of shame, because it all goes back to our upbringing, and, you know, we can go even deeper than that, past life, karmic stuff, and all of that, soul lessons. But really on the basic level, shame originated, toxic shame, in childhood, especially when we were raised by parents or caregivers who tried to get their needs met through us. Ties into narcissistic wounding. Basically, shame-based parents, right, who also have not confronted their own internal shame and then basically project it or give it on to their children. So it's very multi-generational. It can affect our whole ancestor generational line. And it becomes very much internalized and, like we mentioned before, part of the identity. So, for example, as John Bradshaw writes, toxic shame is multi-generational. It is passed from one generation to the next. Shame-based people find other shame-based people and even get married. As each member of a couple carries the shame from his or her own family system, their marriage will be grounded in the shame core. The major outcome of this will be lack of intimacy. It's difficult to let someone get close to you if you feel defective and flawed as a human being. Shame-based couples maintain non-intimacy through poor communication, non-productive circular fighting, games, manipulation, vying for control, withdrawal, blaming, and so on and so forth. When a child is born to these shame-based parents, the deck is stacked from the beginning. With healthy, mature parents, their job is to model, right? Modeling includes how to be a man or woman, how to relate intimately to another person, how to acknowledge and express emotions, how to fight fairly, how to have physical, emotional, and intellectual boundaries, how to communicate, how to cope and survive life's unending problems, and so on and so forth. So obviously, shame-based parents cannot do any of these. So what happens then that the needy, shame-based parents cannot possibly take care of their children's needs. The child is then shamed whenever he or she is needy because the child's needs clash with the parents' needs. So the parents shame the child. The child grows up and becomes an adult. But underneath the mask of adult behavior, there's a child who was neglected. Needy children are insatiable. They have insatiable. Thank you. They have a hole in their soul created by unresolved grief and developmental dependency deficits. This makes them adult children. They can never get enough as adults. Healthy adults are satisfied with what they get and work harder to get more the next time. An adult child can't get enough because it's really a child's needs that are in question. So this whole, when we are, that's why I say we see in this world where a lot of adults, or a lot of wounded children in adult suits.
Yeah.
And we have most of us have this internalized shame, and we're still trying to get our unmet childhood needs met through our partners or through, externalizing and all of that.
Yeah.
But really the basis of this internalized shame is abandonment in our childhood.
Yeah. And that's why the inner child piece, as cliche and cheesy as it may sound to people, this is basically recovering that original light in you that was put out because you didn't have the childhood to support it, essentially. So you need to build that light within yourself again. And he talks about this, and it is, and I've actually found this through my own journey, is that you need to almost go through this soul retrieval with your inner child. And he gives some stages for this. I'm just going to touch on them. So he talks about this first stage, which is recovery. So this is recovering your sense of self-worth through someone who supports and mirrors you. So getting used to talking and sharing your feelings with someone who is going to support you and love you. This is like coach, therapist, someone you got to have someone who can really mirror you in that way, because that resolves this kind of original childhood developmental need to be mirrored, to be seen. But it's important that you also move past this stage. Otherwise, you do create this dependency on the therapist, on the coach, or on the group, like a child who needs its mother. Mm-hmm. So that's really important to remember, that this is just the first stage to get that mirroring, The second stage actually is to grieve the pain of the past losses. And this also usually happens in some sort of relational context, like a therapist, a coach, or whatever, and basically to do this, we're going to need to also temporarily psychically or physically separate from our parents so we can grieve the losses of the inner child. And again, this inner child carries this playfulness, this creativity to our ability to love in a very, spontaneous way, basically. So to the extent that we feel like we don't have that in our lives, that ability to play, to love, to express affection, is to the extent that our inner child has likely been locked away. And in order to grieve properly, we actually need this validation from someone, because often people deny how angry, how sad they are, how much shame they're carrying. And then they have all these defense strategies to pretend that they don't feel vulnerable in any way. So it's important to have that mirroring and that kind of loving connection with someone who can validate and support you in that grieving process. It's very hard to grieve alone, actually. And just even someone being there while we cry, not trying to fix it, not trying to make it go away, not trying to tell us, oh, this is what you need to do or whatever, but just be with us as a human being in that process allows us to process the past.
So that's very important to understand, because the toxic shame, the internalized shame identity has been created in relationship through your upbringing, caretakers, parents, society, anything, we live in a shaming culture to begin with. So as Laura just mentioned, we can only heal in relationship by relating.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work you can do on it by yourself, but it's very limited. So relating doesn't mean that you have to find the perfect partner, intimate relationship and your soulmate and all of that. No, but it can be any friend, can be a therapist, group. So if you say you don't have anyone, that's also part of the lesson, to be able to ask for help, to seek out. And there might be shame coming up, actually.
Yes.
I remember for me, when I was dealing with my own quote unquote shit and shame more coming up, I was ashamed for asking for help.
Yes. That's
right?
normal. Yeah.
So that's normal. So that's also facing that face, in a sense, and act on it despite the shame we're feeling, and just seeking help, seeking that sincere will to heal, because we need to face the shame.
Yeah. And we need to be with it almost like somatically, and like just kind of almost develop our capacity to be with the emotion of shame, and also to really realize that if we're in a near constant state of shame, or we're going into shame spirals just because we shared our feelings honestly with a friend, and then, because this happens a lot with people. I think Brene Brown, who I'm not a big fan of these days, but she talked about how these kind of shame spirals that happen after we're vulnerable with someone, So there's all of these events, which it doesn't make sense logically for us to go into shame. And that's really important for us to look at, because even say if you're like, okay, I need to really heal my shame, I need to reach out, I need to find someone to work with, you may actually be experiencing shame when talking with them and when healing with them, and making, even you could even make up stories in your head that person is shaming you as well, because
Yes.
that's kind of how the psyche works, is like we project our inner world onto the person who is trying to probably help us. So we want to also just kind of realize that first it's important to like just make the shame a little bit more conscious, like be able to consciously start recognizing when you feel shame. And I would invite people to just start talking about the things that they feel shame about with people who are kind of safe, trusted friends. Because I also believe that Brene Brown, she said a very powerful quote that shame can't survive being spoken. I don't know if I agree with that fully, but I do know that there's a very healing thing about releasing shame from the shadows and talking about the things that you feel shameful about. It can be, I don't know what it is, but it kind of just brings it into the conscious awareness, and it almost like removes its power actually from doing that.
Yeah. It's exactly as John Bradshaw says right here. You must be willing to come out of hiding and embrace your toxic shame. If you refuse to admit your powerlessness and the unmanageability of your life, you cannot find the inner strength you have been covering up because you feel flawed and defective. So that's, even from an esoteric spiritual perspective, this is the descent into the darkness, into the shadow, to uncover all that, the exile, right? And it might not feel comfortable, but the avoidance will make it worse over time and time. You will just build a more false facade, a false self. And as John Bradshaw said, that's ultimately hell, because you're not living a true life. You're not living your true self. You're living a lie.
Yeah.
And the only way out is in and through. And he said the good news is that we can recover, and uncover and discover our true self and personal power. And ultimately, it's a twofold process. It's like establishing a healthy sense of self, healthy self-esteem, healthy ego. But ultimately, the true healing, no matter what happened to you in your life, one part of you, the true self, your essence, cannot be harmed by anything. And that's where we need to connect to.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just talk about the last point. So the grieving work takes a long time, by the way. That's not something you just do one therapy session and you're just, I cried a little bit about my childhood and it's done. Like that inner child, and you'll know, because the creative playfulness, this affectionate part of your nature, this loving part of your nature will automatically come forward. Like that's what happens when you free the inner child. It's very obvious because it will show more itself in your personality. Like we have this spontaneous, intuitive, funny, playful part of ourselves that tends to get very locked away. And that's how we know that the inner child needs to be retrieved, basically. So, sharing the shaming experiences, grieving the past, having someone validate our pain somehow, is really important. And that's when the therapist or coach or any safe, non-shaming environment comes in. And then with the grief work comes all sorts of different emotions like anger and loneliness, and it can take a while to kind of retrieve that inner child from usually the prison cell that we've locked it into and start to feel safe to live in our lives again. So we just want to have patience with ourselves through that process. And then this is a huge thing. The last piece, he talks about corrective experiences. So once you feel safe to kind of express your true essence, you'll just feel like yourself again. You'll literally feel like you did when you were a child and you were just playing and being yourself and not a care in the world and no strong inner critic telling you to not to do this or not to do that, And we really start to liberate that inner child and we allow it to start to engage with our life basically again. And so and this child has a healthy sense of itself. It often still needs some mirroring, and some love from us in order to feel safe to kind of come out, So we need to kind of learn how to be with that vulnerable, playful, creative, fun part of ourselves and kind of nurture it and almost like grow it up a little bit and reparent it through the different developmental stages. It probably didn't get, accurate parenting and mirroring. So that's when that kind of self relationship with the inner child needs to be built. And then we also need to grow it up to the level of maturity that it needs to be operating at for our age, basically, So rather than just, I can see people actually get a little bit stuck here as well, where they just do inner child work and then they just kind of have this like, inner child who just does whatever it wants, and it's actually a very destructive inner child because it hasn't grown up yet, So we need to grow up that inner child and allow it to express itself in a healthy way so that we're able to actualize our creative projects, we're able to love people, we're able to show affection to the people around us, and we're also able to have healthy relationships, which is a huge part of it, which are not based on us trying to get the needs of our inner child met through our partner, which I have to say will happen to some extent anyway, but you can't completely depend on your partner to just parent you, basically. Like there needs to be some level of parenting you're able to do yourself. And then, maybe your inner child gets hurt or comes out in your relationship, and then you can do a little bit of repair. But also we want to not like overly project these unmet childhood needs onto our partner, because then it will create a parent-child dynamic, basically.
Exactly. We need to differentiate our unmet childhood needs, which we need to parent within ourselves, or the therapist or group, or some deeper inner work, and not trying to get them fulfilled through our partner or anything else outside ourselves, right? Even like a lot of people we addressed before want to be around like-minded people and groups, especially nowadays, and more power to that. But most often it is driven by unconscious, I'm not good enough program.
I need to be validated.
Shame, and I need to be validated without healing the shame. So we become very dependent, attached to certain groups, movements, and all of that.
But let's not skip that stage, though.
To cover up.
But that's an important stage, though, to get that validation. So the best kind of therapist that, like when you have a therapist who's kind of on the same level with you, or you join some sort of group, you'll feel that sense of safety that you never got in the home.
Yeah, that's very important.
I can be myself. Oh, this person feels like they accept me. I feel like I can be myself around them. That's how you feel, but then you don't want to overly, you need to also be able to be yourself out in the world and not just depend on the therapist or the group or the AA club or whatever, because then that will create the dependency. And I've seen people do this with AA actually as well.
Yes, I see that a lot too, yeah.
So we want to, so those are the kind of stages. If you need to listen over, we talked about the recovery. You need to recover the self-worth through that validation, find a safe space where you can grieve the past losses, and then have corrective experiences, and also developmentally grow up that inner child. And in the second hour, we're going to go into...
Yeah, there I want to really focus. That's a really interesting aspect. I want to go deeper into the creation of the false self and the different aspects of the false self as a cover for the toxic shame. And it's very fascinating because even John Bradshaw talks about that, including, what is her name?
Alice Miller.
Alice Miller. What was a book? Very famous book. I forget. Brain fart. We'll mention it later. The Drama of the Gifted Child.
Yes,
that's it. Very good. That's also raised it. We're going to quote her. But it's really fascinating. out in the world, people we tend to look up to, high achievers, extremely successful people. There are famous, powerful entrepreneurs, millionaires, billionaires. What they're driven by is actually their own unconscious toxic shame.
Yes.
To compensate that wound within and create a certain image, being fueled by this unconscious pain. So that's that's a big topic almost in itself, the idea of success, because we can, from a soul evolutionary perspective, we can quote unquote waste a lot of time, even lifetimes, by denying the wound within, the sacred wound, the toxic shame, toxic guilt, whatever it may be, and trying to avoid it by compensate by building this false self and externalizing, finding only success, happiness out there. And it looks great from a matrix, everyday perspective. You have, all the success, but you haven't really progressed at all on a soul evolutionary level. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, and then we're also going to talk a little bit on the healing strategies that have to do with values as well and behavior, like some, and just kind of addressing it from that point, because that also has a lot to do with why we feel shame. Exactly.
And more healing strategies around that. And I want to also go back to this map by David Hawkins about levels of consciousness of guilt and shame, and how this also ties a bit into your cult, because there's other forces, entities that feed that kind of lower frequency, and kind of keeps us down there through this internalized shame and constantly beating us up and thought injections and all of that. So I want to touch upon that as well. And of course, we also, again, go deeper into this topic and not only on healing shame, but going deeper into shadow work, which is an aspect of that as well, trauma work and all of that, and deeper spiritual work, because ultimately, beyond the psychological progress of childhood, uncovering childhood wounding, healing inner child, we also want to aspire to something higher, a higher power, right? God, the divine, our true self essence, right? That's one aspect that is not harmed, regardless of whatever happened in your childhood. You can recover from it by connecting, by really embracing, bringing forth the true self, our essence. And that's really the ultimate healing journey.
So all of that in the second hour. Again, if you want to join us for a 12-week group coaching program, we have our applications open again at awakenapply.com, or you can go to Bernhard's website, veilofreality.com. And yeah, with that being said, see you in the second hour.
Yes, and if you don't have access to the second hour yet and want to, you can also sign up at my website, veilofreality.com, to the membership. Gets you access to all the second hours, including the membership forum, and it would also help to support our work. Thank you so much, and see you in the second hour.